I'm so confident that I'm right.
I'm just gonna get him to give you a 34 tooth, but it has 32 written on it, so that you just think.
What bike's next? Specialized?
Status, yeah.
Yes. The Status 160 is a bike from Specialized, albeit via their direct-to-consumer brand. It's the slackest bike on test, and also at its current price, the cheapest. The bike manages to combine mixed wheels, an itty-bitty rear end with a long reach figure. But how do those geometry numbers combine, and how does it stack up on the trail? Well, we tuned in with Kaz and Daz for a status report. So that's all the information and data on the status. Let's talk about the bike, the Specialized Status 160. So this is another mixed wheel bike, and the geometry is a bit more extreme. But before we get on to how that affects the descending, Kaz, what's this bike like to climb?
This one is a lot of work to climb, I'd say. It's a really pretty stretched out bike, slack head angle, and the seat tube angle is not that steep. So you do feel like you're kind of a bit on a boat sometimes, and it takes time, a little meandery feel. Not super light either, but I think it's more the geometry. It does give you that stretched out feel. It takes its time getting uphill.
So we always talk about geometry, we always talk about reach. This bike has got a large reach, but it's also got a very short rear end, which is, well, especially comparative to the reach, which is going to give it a very rearward weight bias. Is that something you felt on the climbs, Dario?
I think you feel it when the shock is open and when you're climbing single track. I took this bike on a couple like pretty big rides, but those were like Forest Service climbing roads, and I would just lock the shock out. I had the saddle slammed all the way forward. And honestly, in that setup, it felt fine. Like you're just kind of motoring along. But yeah, on climbing like any Rudy or technical single track stuff, you do feel like you're sagging into it quite a bit. And I noticed that I was standing up climbing way more on this bike than on anything else.
I will say that for climbing, you talk about the short chain stays. You kind of notice it, especially in tight switchbacks. It's just a different way of riding. You kind of get used to getting your weight, you shift your weight, and you can just kind of like swing the front end around. I kind of liked it in a way, but it doesn't feel that balanced. You definitely notice that long front end.
Someone here equated it to like a wakeboard, and I think that's actually a pretty good way of putting it, is that you can just like pivot around the back of the bike, and it works.
But this is the bike with the slackest seat tube angle, as well as, it's 20 mil longer than that Cathro.
Reach, yeah.
That must give a very long, effective top tube.
Yeah.
Do you feel like you're just is it uncomfortable? And talk about sizing. Would you be tempted to actually go for a size smaller on this bike?
I don't know if I'd size down. I think because descending the bike felt fine to me, but I do think that a steeper seat tube angle would help it have a more comfortable climbing position. For sure.
And let's talk about the suspension. You mentioned you locked it out. Is this a bike that is efficient, or is it a grippy bike? How does it track over bumps?
It's a grippy bike. I think for whatever it lacks in like good climbing geometry, it can make up for in technical climbs with how sticky the rear end feels through that. It's helped a bit by having good tires, but we'll talk about that later. Generally just like does climb with a lot of grip, which I like.
One last thing though, we know that these bikes have geometry flip chips in, which obviously make a huge difference, and they wouldn't put in as some sort of shallow marketing ploy. How much difference does the flip chip make on this bike?
On this bike, it actually does make a difference. It's switching the head angle from like half a degree, but also it's lowering the bottom bracket. And I'd say that the low setting, if you want to do any climbing or pedaling, almost unrideable. Just because you're smacking your pedals a lot. It's really, really low. It's kind of fun to descend, but...
Unless you get like 120 mil cranks.
Yeah, you get some of those really short.
Yeah, but then your seat angle is also half a degree slacker. So it's just, I would run this bike in the high setting. Yeah. It's extreme even in the high setting. It feels good there.
Well, that's how it climbs. Let's get on to descending. So this bike is 160 mil travel bike. It's mixed wheeled. It's got extreme geometry. We've talked about the nuances of how it climbs. Darrow, does that come back to you on the descents?
I think whatever shortcomings there are on the climbs, it makes up for in how well it descends like certain terrain. I really liked the way this bike went downhill in like steep stuff with tight corners and when riding features.
But a couple of years ago, we were speaking about, obviously this is the Specialized bike, even though they kind of rebadged it in a way. A couple of years ago, we had that Enduro, and it was steeper than this in the head angle. And it was like a downhill bike compared to a lot of the other Enduro bikes at the time. For a value bike that is so comparatively cheap, This is a really slack, aggressive bike, Kaz.
Oh yeah.
Is it going to have that wide remit for many different types of riders for maybe their first sort of serious full suspension bike?
I wouldn't say so. It's definitely more of a niche bike, but I think if you have that terrain, it's so much fun. In my notes, I wrote that it's a hooligan bike. Like, it makes you want to goof off. You want to slap corners with that short rear end. It jumps super well. But if you do want something it just takes a little bit more attention in certain scenarios. And I think if there's a beginner rider, someone that's not used to this geometry, it could feel pretty awkward at times.
So Dario, could it be that this bike, instead of being a great beginner bike, is actually a really good value bike for experienced riders?
I think so. Like, if for some reason, like, you're a person that owns like a nice trail bike or shorter travel thing, and you want a bike for really steep terrain, maybe for like getting better on jumps, hitting features, this is a great, inexpensive entry to that realm. You know, as Kaz said, it is like a very niche setup, but I think it does those things really, really well.
So a lot of the things about it, that short rear end, that slack head tube angle, that long reach, are going to give it a rearward weight bias, which is going to excel on steeper terrain.
Yeah.
How does that go on flatter turns though? Because in some ways there just won't be the weight on the front wheel.
And exactly, that's what happens. It's not ideal if you have like flat, kind of rolly or meandering terrain. That front wheel just wants to push sometimes. You really have to pay more attention to it. So that's where like I said, it's kind of more purpose-built for the steeps, and when it gets flatter, it can feel like a handful, like climbing, and even just on the dead flats, when you just have to switch direction quickly, the front wheel just it's out there.
It's out there.
Yeah, like our test track that we were like trying to do comparative timing on has a lot of, it's pretty supportive, but like relatively flat corners, and I noticed myself like trying to stay over the front as hard as I could just to make it hook up the way that some of the more conservative bikes do.
Which is a committing riding style that some beginners might find a bit intimidating. If we talk about the suspension feel of this bike, you know, it's a really well spec'd bike. It's got one of those bigger shocks, much like the YT Cathro. Mm-hmm. How does it perform in terms of repeated hits, in terms of tracking? How would you sum up the suspension feel of this bike?
I thought it did really well. It kind of surprised me in some of those circumstances. Like I really like the fork, like the straight grip damper works well. It feels balanced, like front and rear suspension feels quite balanced on this bike. It comes with like an RX tune, which means Specialized has done something with the shim stack and the shock to try to make it work well for this bike. And I think that comes across. Like I never felt like any harsh bottom outs. It felt like you could still pump for speed on flatter terrain, and it handled like big hits pretty well.
Can you talk about some of the standout components, Kaz?
Yeah, I think we touched on the suspension. Like, that grip damper in the fork is great. The shock tune feels excellent too. So you've already got a good frame mixed with solid suspension, and then the brakes has Code R brakes. And at this price point, that's a good brake. Big rotors, plenty of stopping power for the steep terrain this bike's designed for. And then also those tires. I'd say these are the best tires that we have on test. One thing that you do get when you're on a bike at a price point, you tend to get harder rubber compound. This has specialized stickiest rubber compound, the T9 rubber, so you actually get some grip. So I think those are three items that are great.
So we got some bikes with the SRAM DB8s, and we got some bikes with the SRAM Code Rs. Mm-hmm. What did you prefer riding? Did you have enough time to really be able to pick up the nuances of these brakes?
I don't know if I have like a standout preference. I'm more used to the codes and how they feel. Even the Code Rs to me are pretty familiar feeling and like relatively easy to work on. I liked the DB8s just fine. I just don't think I've had enough time on them to say like they're better or worse, but they do feel quite similar. I think the codes might win out in like overall power though.
And in terms of the full picture of the bike, if this was your bike tomorrow, what parts would you be aware of that thinking maybe because of dimension, or maybe because of reliability, or maybe because of performance that you'd be wanting to change out?
I'd probably get a longer dropper post personally, like because I'm leggier and a bit taller. Like I found, especially with like the low cockpit on this bike, I kept wanting to get lower over the frame, and it's got I think a 175 dropper on it, which is pretty long, but I was hitting it on the really steep stuff you want to ride this bike on, and so I would just loosen it and slam that post. So a longer dropper, and I'd keep an eye on the drivetrain. Again, this has NX. Luckily it's Matchmaker NX, which is like a little stiffer, so the shifting is better quality. But those are the two things I would keep an eye out for.
And to be fair, we were talking about, you know, off camera, but that Matchmaker has been good literally for like 10 years now. Yeah. It's really, really great. This bike has, it's similar travel bracket to the Cathro. It's a kilo lighter. That must be down to largely to components, but is there anything that you see that you would change out, or you think is a really strong or? or
Yeah.
perhaps weaker case?
I think with Dario, the drivetrain is really what to keep an eye on. On these NX derailleurs, there's barely any clutch to them, so they kind of flap around a lot. The bike, as it sits, is fairly quiet, but you do hear that chain slap, and sometimes the chain moves enough to even hit the spokes. So that's kind of distracting. So that'd be my main component that I keep an eye on.
What were some plus points about the Specialized status?
Yeah, well, I think we'll start with the price itself of the status is excellent. Like no matter, we'll get into this more in a bit, but great value for parts. And then as far as the way it rides, if you have the terrain and you're the style of rider that this bike suits, it's such a fun time. Like you have to be in the mood, but when you're in that mood, it's a good time. Like I said, wheelies, slapping turns, going through rowdy terrain. They've got something pretty fun here. It's goofy fun. That's how I want to describe it. Goofy fun. Yeah.
So Dario, you're almost as dour and as miserable as me. Talk about some of the negatives of this bike.
The geometry of the status is extreme enough that I think it won't work that well for some people in some places. If you have like flatter terrain with less supportive corners, let's say, it's going to be a little tricky to ride well. I think for us here, we have really steep terrain, so it works really well in that, but it's a pointed bike. Like if you're not hitting jumps, features, and riding steep stuff, it's just going to be a bit too extreme, I think, for some of those. Plus, that seat angle is a bummer for a lot of people, a lot of places. Also, if you're really tall, like any taller than me, and riding the S5, like the XL size, that reach gets super duper long, and the bike is going to feel even more imbalanced.
And would I be right in saying that it has the same rear end, irrespective of reach?
Yeah.
So you could argue the bigger size you go, the more rearward the weight bias will be.
Yeah, I think the S5 is a 515 reach with a 426 rear end, so that's just an extreme disparity.
So let's talk about the thing that everyone's here to know, the donut score in terms of value. How many donuts does this bike get out of 5?
At its sale price, I'm gonna give it 5 donuts.
5 donuts.
Mixed bag, you get some crullers, some buttermilks, some standard glazed stuff.
I don't really know what any of these words mean, but what
They're
about
all tasty.
the non-sale price?
Yeah, I think for full price, I would go down to 4 donuts. Still really good parts and a solid frame, but you're just paying a chunk more for what you get.
So Kaz, who is this bike for?
This bike's for the rider that prioritizes steep terrain, likes hitting jumps, and they also kind of have an eye towards goofing off in the woods rather than being a super serious racer. So if you like fun, steeps, this is the bike for you.
Perfect. Well, that is the review on the Specialized Status 160 mixed wheel bike. Stay tuned for all the field test content coming up.